As the crisis in the Stalingrad and Caucasus regions developed, Stalin was not happy. The loss of the Ukraine, and now the Northern Caucasus, were having severe economic implications for the Soviet Union. The Ukraine was the breadbasket of the nation, as was the Northern Caucasus. Losing them also meant they lost the food needed to feed their comrades. Soviet grain production decreased from 96 million tons in 1940 to 30 million tons in 1942. Meat production dropped from 5 million tons to 2 million tons in the same period. Milk halved from 34 million tons to 16 million tons. Lend-Lease shipments of food simply didn't cover this decrease, with only 346,000 tons delivered by the 30th of June 1942, although it is worth noting this food was dehydrated and so probably represents more than the stated number of tons. The centralised distribution system, which hadn't been so efficient before the war anyway, basically collapsed. Hunger gripped the Soviet Union as the people saw their rations decreased to an amount that was half of what an American citizen would receive. And they didn't even get that. Workers and townspeople were provided with ration cards, but the entitlement stated on them represented a set of aspirations. The system could rarely provide the foods on the card in anything like the stated quantities. In 1942, people were starving to death in Moscow, the capital, where dogs and cats had disappeared off the streets. Bread was available, if you could call it that. It was black. Red Army soldiers were allocated rations that would give them 2,954 calories a day, or 3,450 when in combat. This was simply not enough for a soldier, which is why there were reports of Red Army soldiers living off the land in the Stalingrad area. A British soldier at the time received 5,300 calories a day when fighting in cold conditions, and on average, a soldier from the United States consumed twice as much food as a Soviet soldier in World War II. Plus, these were the officially allocated rations. The centralised food distribution system simply failed to supply the armies with food. At this time, 64th Army was out of fish, fat and sugar, and had barely 3 days' worth of bread and meat left for the troops. Soldiers under fire on the front lines, or those encircled in pockets, often didn't have the opportunity to collect their rations at all. We were running out of munitions and provisions. The wounded were sent to the rear by night on carts and camels. Right from the outset, we were short of food. We started boiling and eating wheat. By the 9th of August, there was nothing left to eat at all. Although, due to various reasons, it is difficult to assess the economy of the Soviet Union, it could be argued that the country was nearing an economic breakdown or even collapse, which is also what Hitler had hoped would happen if he took the Ukraine and the Caucasus in 1942. It was within this context that Stalin therefore issued his now infamous Order 227 on the 28th of July 1942. Some unwise people at the front comfort themselves with arguments that we can continue the retreat to the east, as we have vast territories, a lot of soil, many people, and that we will always have abundance of bread. By these arguments they try to justify their shameful behaviour at the front. But all of these arguments are fully false, faked, and working for our enemies. We no longer have superiority over enemy in human resources and in bread supply. Continuation of retreat means to destroy us and our motherland. Every new piece of territory that we leave to the enemy will strengthen our enemy and weaken us, our defences, our motherland. Stalin was correct when he said that the Soviet Union no longer had superiority over the Axis in human resources. The unoccupied regions of the USSR had a population of 104,600,000. The main members of the Axis, including Finland, had a combined population of around 147,800,000. So the Soviets were actually outnumbered at this point. The conclusion is that it is time to stop the retreat, not a single step back. This should be our slogan from now. We need to protect every strongpoint, every metre of Soviet soil stubbornly, to the last droplet of blood, grab every piece of our soil and defend it as long as it is possible. Stalin therefore implemented draconian measures to prevent his troops from retreating. So what do we lack? We lack order and discipline in companies, regiments and divisions, in tank units, in the Air Force squadrons. This is our major drawback. We have to introduce the strictest order and strong discipline in our army if we want to save the situation and defend our motherland. We can no longer tolerate the fact that the commanders, commissars and political officers allow several cowards to run the show at the battlefield, that the panic mongers carry away other soldiers in their retreat and open the way to the enemy. Panic mongers and cowards are to be exterminated at the site. Yes, Stalin is saying that his commanders are the ones at fault. Now, before you jump to conclusions, this is a middle management technique. Stalin is at the top and the men are at the bottom. In the middle, there's the managers, or commanders in this case. At this time, some officers and generals were issuing orders for their men to retreat and didn't actively try and stop the retreats that had already started, because they wanted to protect themselves and get out of the line of fire. So, in order to get the men to stop retreating, Stalin needs to make sure his commanders aren't retreating as well. He has to deal with these cowardly commanders. From now on, the iron law of discipline for every officer, soldier, political officer should be not a single step back without order from higher command. Company, battalion, regiment and division commanders, as well as the commissars and political officers of corresponding ranks who retreat without order from above, are traitors of the motherland. The officers will be shot. But, unlike before, the officers now have an incentive to keep their men in line. It's in the best interests of the officers to make sure that their men don't retreat, because they themselves will be blamed for it and then shot. It is a classic middle management technique. Yes, the men are still going to get shot for retreating, and 158,000 men are shot in the Red Army for cowardice throughout the war, of which 13,500 are killed fighting for the Stalingrad front during the course of the Battle of Stalingrad, which includes the areas around the city itself, not just the city itself. But the order is primarily aimed at the officers, who are now also liable for the retreats. So this isn't actually officers slaughtering their own men, as it is often portrayed. The officers themselves were getting shot too, or sent to penal battalions. It was aimed primarily at officers and political commissars, rather than the rank and file, which had always been subject to very harsh discipline. And it's worth mentioning that the order also applied to unauthorised retreats, not to retreats in general. If an attack failed, you were allowed to fall back to your own lines. You just weren't allowed to fall back further than that without permission. And even then, there are instances where unauthorised retreats did happen and commanders weren't shot but simply demoted, which we will see later in this series. To implement this order, Stalin orders every front and army to set up penal battalions and blocking detachments. Blocking detachments were also to shoot fleeing cowards, although many of the men who fled were actually stopped by the blocking detachments and sent to the penal battalions. Penal battalions would then be thrown into the most dangerous sectors of the front. This makes a lot of sense considering that the Red Army didn't have an infinite amount of men at this time, especially during the Battle of Stalingrad. Chuikov needs every man he can get at Stalingrad, so shooting the ones he does have doesn't make much sense. And interestingly, a lot of survivors of the war expressed the opinion that it was justified, given the overall situation. It was harsh, but inevitable. The task was to stop the Germans. It was already clear that what happened at Stalingrad was critical, that everything should be decided here. There was nothing else to do. Another example, we knew that this was a time of crisis and felt the pain of our people. There were two options left to us, either to defend Stalingrad or become slaves of the Germans. In addition to this order, the Soviet people were also inspired by anti-German and anti-fascist, or really anti-National Socialist, slogans. Now we know. The Germans are not human. Now the word German has become the most terrible swear word. Let us not speak. Let us not be indignant. Let us kill. If you do not kill the German, he will kill you. If you have killed one German, kill another. There is nothing jollier than German corpses. Yes, Stalin and the totalitarian socialist regime were evil and murdered millions of their own people throughout their reign. But there's no need to exaggerate and distort history in order to show this. Let the events of the Holodomor and the illegal occupation of the Baltic states speak for themselves. Order 227 has been twisted out of all proportions to portray a false picture of the Red Army. This order did lead to executions. It did lead to penal battalions. It was cruel, but it doesn't need to be exaggerated. The Red Army didn't send mass waves of unarmed infantry towards the German guns, one with a rifle and one without, and then shoot them if they decided to turn back because of this order. They simply didn't have the manpower to actually do that, especially not at Stalingrad. Overnight, on the 28th to 29th, Shamshin's 22nd Tank Corps rolled into Kachelinskaya, east of the Don. In the morning, their T-34s and T-70s rolled across the river and prepared to capture Vientsy and nearby Mukhovninsky. They had no infantry support, no reconnaissance, 55 of their tanks had not yet arrived, and not all of Shamshin's force had been organised by his officers to go into combat. Still, Shamshin decided to attack with what he had. Therefore, 182nd and 173rd Tank Brigades advanced blind into the sights of the German guns, while the 176th Tank and 133rd Heavy Tank Brigades stayed behind to collect themselves after the crossing. 100th Jaeger and 60th Motorised Divisions, with a Kampfgruppe from 16th Panzer Division, took out 14 Soviet tanks and successfully resisted this advance. Meanwhile, Zhuravlev, in a desperate situation, decided to order a breakout of his pocket. At dawn, the remaining 27 tanks of 13th Tank Corps led the way, pushing Weber's 54th Jaeger Regiment back and taking Verkhney Buzinovka in the afternoon. Heading northeast, the Soviet tanks overran the command post of 14th Panzer Corps. Luckily for the Germans though, General von Wietersheim wasn't captured and continued to command his forces. The Germans later claimed that they had been struck by 40 Soviet tanks, not 27. And in the Kalach area, 131st Rifle Division advanced against the German units to the north. They were supported by the 4 remaining KV tanks of 158th Tank Brigade in what was clearly another desperate counterattack. Once again, the KV tanks were separated from their infantry and artillery support, caught in a crossfire, and were compelled to fall back. As Isaev comments, it was more like a pin shot than a counterattack. To the south, 112th Rifle Division, supported by tanks, continued its attack at the lower Scher. The Stavka had ordered Gordov to defeat the enemy in the 64th Army's area, and the 229th and 214th Rifle Divisions did attempt a counterattack, but this achieved nothing of note. So, for the most part, combat in 64th Army's area was limited. The German 71st Infantry and Romanian 20th Divisions cleared and captured villages occupied by Soviet stragglers on the western bank of the Don, and the other German forces regrouped and brought up supplies, but otherwise it was a quiet front. At the strategic level, the Germans in the region had just cut the railway lines that ran from the north to the Caucasus. The Soviets could now no longer reinforce the Caucasus front effectively. So Hitler and the High Command now realised that the Soviets weren't focusing on stopping their southern advance, but were instead concentrating the bulk of their forces in the Stalingrad region to defend the Volga. This was a little unexpected. Hitler also knew that Paulus was already having a tough time in the Kalach area. Thus, it became clear that Paulus's 6th Army would need substantial reinforcements in order to keep the advance going, which was why Halder and the others in the High Command urged Hitler to divert forces from Army Group A to Army Group B. The decision was made to reinforce Army Group B with the Italian 8th Army. This would relieve 6th Army's divisions defending along the Don to the west and free them up to move further east. The OKH also prepared to reinforce 6th Army with 11th Army Corps, which had 2 divisions, the 76th and 295th Infantry Divisions. In addition, and probably more importantly, Hitler now ordered Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, currently heading south towards the Caucasus with Army Group A, to turn northeast and attack towards Stalingrad. This was a major turn of events. Taking the oil fields would solve the crisis going on in the Third Reich and ease the logistical issues in the Wehrmacht. But the OKH and Hitler ignored the economic priority of the Caucasus and shifted substantial forces to Army Group B instead. Now, arguably this was a necessary order given the circumstances. But either way, the Soviet counterattacks had forced the Germans to make a decision, and in the end, they decided to dilute the strength of their main thrust into the Caucasus in order to reinforce Paulus's 6th Army on its quest to secure the northern front. While this would make the subsequent events incredibly interesting from our perspective, this decision, and the previous decision in Führer Directive No. 45 to head south without securing the northern front first, would have dire consequences for the Fall-Blau campaign and the war as a whole. 30th of July 1942. Several T-34s from Group Zhuravlev surprised Huber's headquarters at first light. Men pulled their clothes on as they leapt into their vehicles, which then scarpered in all directions. A company from 2nd Panzer Regiment arrived to resolve the situation, destroying 6 of the Soviet tanks. Outside the pocket, the 176th Tank Brigade of 22nd Tank Corps was sent towards Ossinovsky, in anticipation of Group Zhuravlev reaching them. This, and Shamshin's other 2 tank brigades, with the 184th and 192nd Rifle Divisions, continued to mount attack after attack, trying to batter 8th Army Corps' defences. Their assaults went in without sufficient support, and so they would lose another 41 tanks in the fighting. While the main body of Group Zhuravlev had broken out of their pocket and were still trying to reach safety, elements of 113th Infantry Division marched in to close the gap behind them. This allowed Weber to retake Verkhney Bolzinovka, after which the Axis then started devouring the leftover Red Army troops in the pocket. They were supported in this task by Luftwaffe ground support aircraft and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. This wasn't an easy fight, and countless dead Red Army soldiers and burnt out tanks littered the battlefield. Also on this day, the remains of 54th Jaeger Regiment were able to reoccupy the area they had been smashed at 2 days previously. To their horror, they discovered that the Red Army soldiers had massacred all the German wounded who had fallen into their hands. Of course, killing unarmed and wounded soldiers is a terrible crime, which is why we can't feel too sorry for the Axis on this occasion, since somewhere between 3.1 and 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war were shot, starved or otherwise murdered in the hands of the Germans in World War II. The point being, both sides were fighting an ideological and brutal war of extermination, so it's hard to feel sympathy for any of them. Unjustified murder was the name of the game for both National Socialist Germany and the Marxist Socialist Soviet Union. Anyway, in the Kalach area, 158th Tank Brigade had received 9 new KV tanks. It was therefore decided to mount another counterattack. But once again, they went in without infantry or artillery support. Clearly, the Soviet commanders weren't learning from their previous mistakes. However, the 189th Tank Brigade of Kazhin's 23rd Tank Corps had finally arrived and was also committed into action, again with no support, and lost half of its tanks. 11 of the brigade's T-34s and 12 of its T-70s were burning by the end of the day. In Churikov's area, the 214th Rifle Division and the 154th Naval Rifle Brigade were finally withdrawn from their bridgehead on the western side of the Don. By this point, 214th Rifle Division was down to just 7,762 men from 12,267 5 days earlier. Yes, it had lost 4,505 men in barely 5 days of combat with German troops south of the Cher, which is an appalling attrition rate. With a definite split between the North Caucasus Front and the Stalingrad Front, some changes had to be made. 51st Army was transferred from the North Caucasus Front to the Stalingrad Front in order to help with the command situation. And Churikov was now replaced as commander of the 64th Army. Churikov claims he was informed that he was going to be replaced 2 days earlier, and it's not clear if this was the case or not, but he was still in command until late on the 30th. The reason given for this dismissal is because Gordov wasn't happy that Chuikov had permitted his troops to withdraw to the Cher and the Don in the previous days. Gordov demanded that Chuikov submit a report to him explaining his actions. So Chuikov persuaded Gordov to let him write the report at 64th Army's HQ, saying that this was where all the files and maps were needed in order to write the report. Gordov granted him that request. Now, Chuikov writes in his memoirs that Gordov wasn't in touch with the reality on the ground, imagining that the Germans were pinned down in position by Red Army forces. He notes that Gordov had no idea that Paulus was preparing another attack, and that Gordov was relying upon wishful thinking. In the 1959 version of his The Beginning of the Road, which was uncensored at the time but later censored for the 1963 release, he describes Gordov by saying, "He was an aging general with tired grey eyes, which seemed unable to see, and their cold stare seemed to read, 'Don't tell me about the situation. I know everything, but I can't do anything since my fate has been already sealed.'" With obvious defeatist inclinations, Gordov ordered that only part of the army maintained a position in the Don Bend, and reserves were left on the east bank of the river. It's hard to know if any of this character description is true or not, or if Chuikov was just trying to make excuses for why he was dismissed from his position. We know that not all of the troops had had time to get to the front, which would explain the reserves being left behind bit. But what is clear is that Chuikov's army had prevented Paulus's southern pincer from reaching Kalach. So yes, arguably his men had retreated prematurely when they shouldn't have done so, but he had succeeded in stopping the Germans. That fact was clearly not important now though. Chuikov, the future hero of Stalingrad, was removed from his command by Gordov, and Shumilov became the commander of the 64th Army. 31st of July 1942. The 99th Tank Brigade of 23rd Tank Corps had arrived to reinforce its half-destroyed 189th Tank Brigade. They both now decided to strike the 160th Panzer Battalion's lines, but did so without proper infantry or artillery support, which once again undermined their attack. The Germans took out 16 Soviet tanks, although claimed 18. But this was nothing compared to what happened in the air. The 8th Air Army lost 27 aircraft, mostly IL-2s, whilst in return 8th Flieger Corps lost just 3 aircraft. Soviet reinforcements arriving at nearby train stations also had a nasty surprise, as 4 of their trains were hit by Richthofen Stukas, completely destroying them. And even better for the Axis, 100th Jaeger Division and 113th Infantry Divisions approached from the north, finally relieving Schlomer's pocket. Supplies flowed in, easing the pressure on the bruised and battered troops. As a result of this reunion of forces, Kampfverband Schlomer was dissolved, and the units within were resubordinated to their parent units. They had survived the ordeal of encirclement, this time at least. And after much fighting, Zhuravlev's force reached 22nd Tank Corps near Ozanovsky and Verkhney Golubaya late on the 31st of July. 5,000 Soviet men and 66 tanks plus artillery managed to get to safety, but Zhuravlev himself was wounded in the process. Much like Shlomo's pocket, Zhuravlev's men had also survived encirclement. However, this had come at a price. The 13th Tank Corps had been so badly beaten up in its attack into and breakout of the pocket that its remnants were actually downgraded to brigade strength. They were renamed the 169th Tank Brigade, becoming part of 22nd Tank Corps. However, by the 31st of July 1942, the race to the Don was over. The Soviets had stopped the Axis in their tracks, and Stalingrad was safe for now. The Stalingrad front had lost over half of its 1,239 tanks, with 14th Panzer Corps reporting that they alone had taken out 482 Soviet tanks. It's worth noting that the majority of the Soviet tanks hadn't been taken out in combat, but had actually broken down on their way to the battlefield. That said, these should probably be counted towards the total losses because the Soviet tankers had had to abandon them on the battlefield, probably due to not having enough maintenance, recovery and logistical services. Despite this, the Stalingrad front still had more than double the number of tanks that Paulus's two Panzer Corps had, with around 500 in their arsenal. Plus, the Soviets were able to replace their tanks far quicker than the Germans, although the Germans were much better at repairing and recovering theirs. Stalin saw these breakdowns as implausible and blamed them on deliberate sabotage by certain tank crews in order to avoid combat. It's not clear if this was the case, or whether Soviet industry was just bad at creating and maintaining tanks. It is clear though that the Red Army had insufficient maintenance services in the area and had hastily sent in all their tanks racing across the Don and into the sights of the German guns without adequate air, artillery or infantry support. Considering all this, it would be safe to assume that sabotage wasn't the real reason for so many tank breakdowns in the Red Army. But either way, Paulus and his forces had successfully beaten back the Soviet counterattacks, even though they had been substantially outnumbered. That said, 14th Panzer Corps did lose over half of its tanks, and perhaps more importantly, had failed to reach Kalach. The southern force was also stopped after crossing the Cher, meaning Paulus had failed to encircle all the Soviet forces west of the Don. It was also clear that Paulus could no longer seize Stalingrad on the march, as he had originally wanted to. Sacrificing massive losses, Gordov's forces had brought the Axis to a halt, and it appeared to the German High Command that Paulus wouldn't reach Stalingrad now without significant reinforcements. The advance guard of the 6th Army crossed the Cher on 20th July and 3 days later reached the Don Bend south of Kremenskaya. The leading 14th Panzer Corps, General of Infantry von Wietersheim, gained the area around Kalach but could go no further due to a lack of fuel. Behind them, the infantry divisions carried out their deployments. These are the words of Werner Hapt, a Wehrmacht veteran who took part in the fighting on the Eastern Front. His words here heavily imply that it wasn't the Soviets that stopped the 6th Army, but purely the lack of fuel. He does say that the advance was delayed, mainly by supply problems and by a counterattack by Soviet troops, which pushed the 51st Army Corps back in places. This developed into the battle between the Cher and the Don, in which 12 Russian rifle divisions and 5 tank brigades attacked the eastern advancing 6th Army. He then jumps ahead to the 4th of August, and that's it. All the fighting we've witnessed so far in the series, all the bloodshed and back and forth action is condensed into 2 paragraphs, both of which heavily suggest that the only reason the Sixth Army stopped was because of fuel problems. The Soviet counterattack only pushed one of the German infantry corps back in places. There's only one sentence that actually mentions the titanic struggle that took place in the first phase of the Battle of Stalingrad. And he's not alone. To give another example out of many accounts that do the same, Torsten Diederich, in his biography of Paulus, says that it was a personal telephone call to Hitler from von Weichs's Army Group headquarters that allowed Paulus to get the restrictions of supply taken off, and of course this took time. This was the reason why the Sixth Army was forced to spend precious days on the Don before Kalach, before the assault on Stalingrad could begin. Not a hesitation of the commander-in-chief, as some historians superficially judge. Most accounts of this period are just like this, and the reason is simply because they're written by German authors who are sticking to German records. Just like Happ's account, Diederich barely even mentions the fighting at Kalach. One of Paulus's officers, Colonel Wilhelm Adam, only gives a few passing references to the Battle of the Don Bend near Kalach, and the overall impression is that it didn't even happen. The spearhead of the 6th Army was now the 14th Panzer Corps. On the 23rd of July, its divisions forced their way into the Big Don Bend south of Kremenskaya. Within a short time, the Don was reached near Sirotinskaya, but yet again, this was a blow into empty space. The enemy had escaped over the Don. Even secondary sources written by historians have missed this period out, mainly because their reliance on the German accounts rather than the Soviet sources. Beaver's highly popular book also only gives a general feeling of this period over a couple of pages, and while it does mention the Soviet tank losses, Beaver doesn't actually describe how the fighting played out, or mention that Paulus' 6th Army had been stopped dead in its tracks while the counterattacks were going on. All of these accounts and more talk as though the 6th Army had no trouble at all until they walked into Stalingrad. Only then did things turn sour. Well, it's hard not to conclude that these accounts have missed an incredibly crucial period in the Stalingrad campaign, the battle for the Great Don Bend, the battle we've just witnessed. This is the reason why most books written in German or English, and even internet accounts, state that the Battle of Stalingrad began in late August 1942. Russian sources, on the other hand, begin the battle in July, acknowledging that this was when the fighting for the city actually began. Now, a lot of people in the West don't think you can trust the Soviet sources. And you can't trust them. But you can't trust the German sources either. They're all untrustworthy and pushing their agendas. However, in this case, even some of the German primary sources admit that this was, to quote Halder's own diary from the 25th of July 1942, the first phase of the Battle of Stalingrad. So it's not like the Soviet accounts are incorrect here. The reality was that the Battle of Stalingrad started in late July, but most of the German accounts don't want you to look there because this would go against the narrative set up after the war that the Wehrmacht was this efficient, well-oiled machine, and if only they hadn't entered into the city of Stalingrad itself, everything would have been fine. This narrative is the one, ironically, set up by Halder, who is trying to shift the blame from the clean and amazing Wehrmacht to Hitler and his cronies. Now yes, Hitler is to blame for some of it, but the reality is that it was Halder who planned the failure of Fall Blau. It was the inefficiencies of the German logistical system which bogged down the troops. It was the Soviets who counterattacked and stopped them outside of Kalach. But by ignoring the fighting outside of the city, we can ignore all this and just blame Hitler. If only Hitler hadn't sent us into the city, we would have been good. It's just rubbish. Worse, this first phase was perhaps more important than the fighting for the city itself. Why? Because it dictated the course of the events once the Sixth Army did get into the city. Now that he had been stopped, Paulus could no longer take Stalingrad on the march. He had to fight for every inch of ground, starting not in the city, but at the Don. This would force him to take actions which would limit his drive into the city itself and the fighting within it. And it would wear down his forces so that they were weaker when they finally did get to the street fighting. Missing this entire portion of the fighting is simply unacceptable. Another false conclusion given by Hapt, Diedrich and Simler is that the Germans only stopped because of logistical issues. Colonel Adam spends barely any time talking about the Battle of Kalach, but does talk for 2 pages about the supply issues the Sixth Army faced at the time. Yes, there was a lack of fuel and ammunition hindering the German advance. However, it seems strange how the supply problems were present before the two sides clashed in late July, and yet on the very same day that they do start to fight, when the Soviets also mount counterattacks, Paulus's army suddenly stops dead in its tracks. Isn't that just a little too coincidental? Well, as we have seen, we cannot ignore the stubborn Soviet resistance and the incredibly heavy counterattacks, both of which had prevented Sixth Army from achieving its goal of getting to Kalach and taking Stalingrad on the march. The Soviet counterattacks, failures nonetheless, are what stopped Axis forces, helped by the lack of ammunition and fuel and the logistical problems. It could be argued that if the Axis had had the fuel that they needed, they may have had an easier time of it, or even taken Kalach. But the Soviet counterattacks were always going to cause them problems and prevent them from taking Stalingrad on the march. Simply ignoring the Soviets as just a minor distraction would be disingenuous, because they played a major role in stalling the Sixth Army. Relooking at the events, the Germans had struck the 192nd Rifle Division in the north and the 33rd Guards Rifle Division in the centre, and had rushed to the Don. Glantz correctly concludes that the 192nd Rifle Division was stretched too thin in the north, which allowed 2 German motorised and part of 1 infantry division to smash through their lines. After this point, the Germans had the major task of trying to contain the pocket that they had created, Group Zaravlev. They had insufficient infantry forces to do this, which is perhaps why they couldn't advance to Kalach. Although at the same time the Soviets counterattacked and hit them hard. These Soviet tank attacks were mounted far too hastily, without infantry and artillery support, and went in drips and drabs, rather than all in one steel punch. And Stalin should probably take the blame for insisting that these attacks go in straight away. The result was a large graveyard of Soviet tanks, after a swirling mess of a battle that neither side was really in control of. And it's interesting because when the Soviets did mount a combined arms attack with infantry, tanks and so on, they did pretty well. Elements of Group Zhuravlev struck out on the 28th and delivered significant pain to the 54th Jaeger Regiment and a battalion from the Croatian Legion. It seems strange how surrounded troops in a pocket could mount a far more organised and effective attack and do more damage than outside forces trying to break in. Again, this is added evidence that the haste of the Soviet attack, without time to properly organise infantry and tank cooperation, is probably what was to blame for the huge losses that they suffered. 6th Army claimed to have taken out 600 Soviet tanks. 14th Panzer Corps alone claimed 482 of them. Tanashchin's 13th Tank Corps lost 86 of its 152 tanks, and Rodin's 28th Tank Corps well more than 2/3 of its 178 tanks. Although they continued to fight during the first weeks of August, Shamshin's 22nd Tank Corps saw about 80% of its 180 tanks put out of action by 6th of August, and Kazhin's 23rd Tank Corps squandered more than 2/3 of its 178 tanks during the same period. Paulus's men had also suffered heavily in the intense fighting during these counterattacks. 100th Jaeger Division was decimated. Reinforcements were received for its 2 German regiments, but the Croatian regiment had to be reformed into 1 battalion due to the casualties it had sustained. 14th Panzer Corps had lost over half of its panzers, although many were repairable and would be put back into action soon. Accurate numbers for overall casualties for either side are not available for this neglected period, but it is noted that the losses occurred in 6th Army's infantry formations, as well as in motor vehicles and panzers, would have a significant impact when Paulus finally reached the city. Clearly, the easy fighting that had dominated the early Blau period was over, and the Germans hadn't even got to Stalingrad yet. And the Soviet counterattacks, failures or not, had compelled Hitler and the OKH to shift forces from Army Group A, heading to the Caucasus, to Army Group B and Paulus's 6th Army. This was a major turn of events, perhaps of strategic importance, since the Germans would have fewer forces to take the Caucasus. And Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, though it would be substantial reinforcements for Paulus's 6th Army, may not be enough to ensure victory at Stalingrad either. This was all a consequence of Hitler's decision to advance into the Caucasus before securing the northern flank along the Don and the Volga. He had effectively split the focus of his attack into 2 priorities, and when you chase 2 rabbits, you catch neither. Thanks for watching, bye for now.